This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 869 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. To anyone who pre-ordered the Late Round Prospect Guide, first off, thank you. I greatly appreciate your support. But second, the guide should be in your inbox. I sent it out on Sunday to everyone, and anyone who now goes to lateround.com to purchase it, you're paying the full price of $14.99. But the pre-draft version of the guide can be instantly downloaded. Once the NFL draft is finished, if you had purchased the guide, you'll get an email with the updated version of the guide. That updated version will go out the weekend of the draft. One of the things that's featured in the prospect guide is my year 2 model. I feel like I've mostly been talking about the prospect stuff over the last couple of months, but the year 2 model is super important too. That model was built with an old Late Round podcast episode in mind. Back in the day, I did an episode called Bailing on Unproductive Rookies. It was episode 343. The concept of that episode was about how we as fantasy managers might want to consider getting rid of second-year players who are very unproductive as rookies. And when I say unproductive, that's in the context of other rookies. Because essentially, when players had bad rookie seasons, when they perform below expectation, they very rarely turn into huge league-winning fantasy football assets. Rather than just guessing which second-year players we should trade away, I eventually built the year 2 models. They give me a score that tries to predict how well a player is going to perform in year 2 and year 3 of their NFL careers. If the score is low, then I know based on history, that player might struggle. If it's high, the opposite happens. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more today as sort of a rebrand of that older episode that I once did. Because through the years, my analysis has changed. The way I approach things has changed. So it's a topic that I think is important to revisit. Before getting into all that stuff though, don't forget to check out Underdog Fantasy. It's the best and easiest place to play fantasy sports. You can draft a fantasy football team in minutes, and with their best ball format, there's no waivers, trades, or lineup setting. There's no league management after you draft. You can sit back and relax. Drafts are happening right now over there, and you can use the information that I share on this podcast or in my prospect guide to help you draft. If you're new to Underdog, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up, and you'll get a deposit match up to $100. That's promo code LATEROUND. Head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog Fantasy app to sign up. I want to start out today's discussion by talking about the year 2 model at a high level. Because I think when I share some of these probabilities, you're going to be pretty surprised when you really dig into these results. The year 2 model, both at running back and wide receiver, it looks at a player's prospect score, and then it looks at a bunch of metrics from his rookie season in the NFL. It combines all of those things to get a year 2 score. And like I said, that year 2 score is trying to predict how well a player is going to perform in fantasy football in year 2 and year 3 of his NFL career. I've got some cool charts in the prospect guide that show historical hit rates at different year 2 model scores. For instance, of the wide receivers drafted from 2011 to 2021, and I'm stopping at 2021 here because those players have now played 3 years in the league, but of the wideouts drafted from 2011 to 2021, of the ones who had a year 2 score between 95 and 100, 60% of them gave fantasy managers a 16 plus PPR point per game season in either year 2 or year 3 of their careers. 40% of them posted an 18 plus PPR point per game season, which is a very, very good season at wide receiver. When you look at the 90 to 95 group, their rate of scoring 16 or more PPR points per game in either year 2 or year 3, it drops to 32%. So it's 60% for the elite group and then 32% for this next one. Then that number continuously falls as you get lower and lower in year 2 score. What's wild is that the year 2 database has never seen a wide receiver who had a year 2 score below 80 get to 16 or more PPR points per game in their second or third year in the league. For context, 16 PPR points is usually a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 season. So anyone since 2011 who's been below that 80 mark, you can kiss upside goodbye. The biggest name from last year's class that's right there, that's right at 80, is probably Jonathan Mingo. Trey Palmer is under that 80 mark as well. The chance that these players actually reach some status of being super usable in fantasy football, those chances are slim. I highly doubt that Jonathan Mingo is going to be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy over the next 2 years, in just one of those 2 seasons. But even players in like the 80 to 85 range, they have rough odds. Only 4% of them have gotten to 16 or more PPR points per game. This year, that's Demario Douglas, Quentin Johnston, Marvin Mims, and Jalen Hyatt. Again, all of this stuff is in the prospect guide. You can get profiles on all of these guys too. I'm just giving you an idea of how clear-cut it can sometimes be to bail on these unproductive rookies. Running back is a little bit different. And it's because running back just has more natural volatility when you're trying to project how well a player is going to do in his second or third year in the league. Not only are we measuring off of one season, so a player could just see a massive workload one year and sort of skew these results, but running back volume and fantasy points come down to a coaching decision. If the coach wants a split backfield, he gets a split backfield. Just ask Bijan Robinson. Those decisions are hopefully driven by talent, yes, but it's not as seamless as it is a wide receiver. Running back year 2 scores sort of fall into 3 clusters. Any player over a score of 90 is in a pretty good spot, especially if they're over the 95 mark. Players over the 95 mark, like Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, those running backs have scored 18 or more PPR points in either year 2 or year 3 at a 44% clip. A player with a score from 70 to 90, that's the second cluster. He's more up in the air. These are your standard RB2s in fantasy football, generally speaking. We rarely will get a highly elite player from that group. But we can definitely get RB1 seasons from this cluster. We just saw that with Rachaad White this past year. And then a score under 70, a year 2 score below 70, that's where we don't see many hits. To be more specific, from 2011 to 2021, only 2 running backs with year 2 scores below 70 gave us a 16 plus PPR point per game season in year 2 or year 3. Those were CJ Anderson and Myles Gaskin. Now, if you expand that and you look at 2022 and 2023 as well, you get Kyren Williams as part of that group too. So there's 3 of them, 3 running backs who are below that 70 mark to give us an RB1 season in year 2 or year 3. When you're looking at 14 or more PPR points per game, more RB2 type seasons, you add Damian Harris and Chris Carson to the list. And Damian Harris was at 14.01 points per game. Needless to say, none of those running backs, aside from maybe Chris Carson, had year in, year out high-end production. And we'll see what happens with Kyren Williams. The models aren't going to capture everything. I'm not trying to sell it that way. But the year 2 model has done a pretty good job at capturing which running backs should at least be in our consideration sets. And this goes back to what I talked about a couple of months ago about Chase Brown. Tank Bigsby is under the 70 mark this year, which is no surprise. But Chase Brown is too. I don't think it automatically means you have to fade the guy, at least in redraft. In early underdog drafts, his ADP has been reasonable enough when you consider everything that's been up in the air with that Cincinnati backfield. And now Joe Mixon was released. So I'd imagine that ADP is going to rise. It's also a little different from a best ball perspective when you know Brown has some big play ability. But regardless of that, in terms of investing in him long term, he'll need to be somewhat of an outlier in order to give you higher end production. Even without Mixon around. Zach Moss is there anyway, and Zach Moss might be better than Joe Mixon. Chase Brown isn't the first running back in history to have an opportunity in his backfield with this low of a score. Anything is obviously possible. That's not the point here. The point here is probability. The year 2 model can help us spot these unproductive rookies, and it can make us feel more confident in moving on from them. That's one of the hardest things to do in fantasy football, is to move on from players because you're afraid that they're going to blow up on someone else's team. And it's not going to be 100% perfect, but it's definitely going to help us across multiple moves. Probability is on our side when we use these models. Now, something I only started researching recently about this is the degree in which a player's score falls from year 1 to year 2. Let me explain. A player gets some prospect score when he enters the league. He gets a ZAP score because the model I use is called the ZAP model. That ZAP score will either increase or decrease when compared to a player's year 2 score because both scores are out of 100. So for example, Zay Flowers entered the league with a ZAP score of 90.4. His year 2 score is now 96.8. So he saw an increase of 6.2 points from year 1 to year 2. Clearly, someone with a high ZAP score will typically drop in year 2 score because it's difficult for him to get any better. If he has a ZAP score of 99, it's really hard to get better than 99 in a year 2 score, even if that ZAP score is part of the year 2 calculation. Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs had ZAP scores above 98. They had good rookie seasons, so their year 2 scores are actually just as high. But it's a lot harder for them to maintain their score versus someone who had a ZAP score of like 60 or 70. What I was curious about was what happens when a player sees a fairly dramatic shift downwards in ZAP score to year 2 score. In other words, what happens when a player really underperforms during his rookie season versus how his prospect score expected him to perform? Let me give you an example. This new ZAP model, it liked Jaxon Smith-Njigba even more than the last model iteration did. Which, yeah, looking like a not great call right now. That's going to happen, though. Unfortunately, my rookie rankings last year had Gibbs above JSN. But regardless of all of that, JSN had a pretty good score in that ZAP model. It was 98. His year 2 score, 92.8. So his score dropped by over 5 points. That type of dip in ZAP score to year 2 score is not very encouraging at all, actually. From 2011 to 2021, there were 21 wide receivers who had ZAP scores above 90 who then saw that score drop by 5 or more points in the year 2 model. That may seem like a lot of wide receivers, but keep in mind what I just said. A high score is really difficult to maintain. But get this, of those 21, only one of them scored 14 or more PPR points per game in a season in either year 2 or year 3. That's a rate of 4.8%. Of the wide receivers who didn't see that big of a drop, their rate of getting 14 or more PPR points per game was almost 77%. Now you might be thinking, well, that player's year 2 score is now lower. Jaxon Smith-Njigba, his year 2 score is now 92.8. Other players who had a similar ZAP score as JSN, their year 2 scores are probably higher. That's why we have the year 2 model in the first place. There's also a big difference between a player who had a ZAP score of 91 and one who had a ZAP score of 98. The players above the 95, 96 range usually have pretty awesome hit rates. This is just an exercise about understanding how players produce once they had disappointing rookie campaigns. But let's focus on players who had a ZAP score of 96 or above before seeing that 5+ point drop. Those players at wide receiver since 2011 include Corey Coleman, Corey Davis, Rashad Bateman, and Jameson Williams. Those are the guys that are grouped up with Jaxon Smith-Njigba right now. Those are the players who had ZAP scores above 96, and then they dropped in year 2 score by 5 or more points. As we know, it didn't happen for any of those guys. Maybe it happens for Jameson Williams, but it's not looking great for him. Especially because this is trying to predict year 2 and year 3. So if it does happen for Jameson Williams, it has to happen in 2024. Now you can look at the same type of thing at running back too. From 2011 to 2021, so again, that gives running backs 3 years of NFL experience. But from 2011 to 2021, we had 12 running backs who had a ZAP score above 90, then fall by 5 points in the year 2 model. 5 or more points. Of those 12, none of them had a season with 14 or more PPR points per game in year 2 or year 3. So they entered the league as pretty good prospects, and then they had bad rookie seasons. And then in year 2 and in year 3, they did not perform. Now, a couple of them did perform after year 3, like Mark Ingram, that's one of them. Derrick Henry's another. People forget that Derrick Henry had a pretty late breakout. But we're talking Mikel LaSure, Ryan Williams, David Wilson, Darius Geis, Rashad Penny, Ronald Jones, Royce Freeman, Sony Michel, A.J. Dillon, and Cam Akers. Now, if you expand that sample to beyond 2021, you do get one more player. And that one player did buck the trend, and that's Travis Etienne. But obviously circumstances were way different with Etienne because he missed his rookie season. When higher end prospects end up giving us a bad season, and those prospects don't hit on the right peripheral numbers either, which is what the year 2 model is looking at, those prospects usually don't work out. They're usually the ones that we should bail on because those are the prospects that still hold some value in Dynasty too. And you do see similar trends at all levels, not just for players who had ZAP scores in the 90s. Every single level of ZAP score shows that when a player sees a significant drop from year 1 score to year 2 score, that player has a worse hit rate than others who have similar year 2 scores. Now, like I said, this stuff is pretty new. The drop in score isn't part of my evaluation right now, at least mathematically. It's more subjective. The year 2 model is largely going to catch this stuff. But it's more evidence that when a player fails to meet expectation in a big way as a rookie, it's evidence that you might want to move on from that player, as long as the market is giving you the right price. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering what this means for the 2023 class. And I can tell you that at running back, it's basically Tank Bigsby. Bigsby's the big disappointment. He went from having a ZAP score of 82.9 to a year 2 score of 63.4. He obviously might have the ability to have some spiked weeks. Maybe Travis Etienne gets hurt. But I'm not convinced that he'll ever be a league-winning player. Anything can obviously happen, especially at a more volatile position like running back, but we don't see it from players like this. We generally don't see a Tank Bigsby-like player do very, very well in the NFL after such a bad rookie season. Some other one-off running backs who saw their ZAP score drop by 5+ points compared to their year 2 score include Deuce Vaughn, Izzy Abanikanda, Sean Tucker, Evan Hall, and Zach Evans. Now, I understand that injuries play a role here, but injuries do set players back. That's just the reality of the game. Wide receiver to me is more interesting. Again, the year 2 model is going to help you understand range of outcomes. Jaxon Smith-Njigba having a 92.8 score means there's still some shot that he's a big producer. It's just that when you layer on top the fact that he saw his score drop by so many points, things get shakier. But beyond JSN, you also have Quentin Johnston. The ZAP model actually didn't like QJ nearly as much as the market. He had a ZAP score of 89.7, which is low for a first-round pick. But his year 2 score is 81.6. That drop in score is a really bad sign. You also get big drops from Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman. The model definitely overrated Hyatt given his crazy final season in college, but I had written about his volatility entering the league. He had a really high slot rate, but he didn't profile as a slot guy in the NFL. And he landed in a spot in New York where his team had plenty of slot players. That forced Hyatt to the outside in year 1. And even if he does move more into the slot in year 2, it's tough to be overly optimistic. Cedric Tillman is just dust. The Browns just traded for Jerry Jeudy, and Tillman had some of the worst route run peripherals that we've ever seen. He was horrible in 2023. Sure, he's a decent guy, but he was not great on a football field. Turns out those Tennessee wide receivers just weren't it in the 2023 class. Now, I don't think all of these players are must-sells per se, because anyone you buy or sell, that should be related to what the market's saying. But we need to be cautious with these guys. There's no doubt about that. All of those players that I just mentioned have some very, very big red flags. You might want to consider bailing on them before it's too late. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. It's a Late Round Perspectives week, and that episode's going to drop Friday morning. I'll talk to you then.